This video begins with a very simple idea. There are towns in America where you don't need to step inside anyone's house, go on a ghost tour, or blindly believe in legends to feel uneasy. Just passing by late enough is enough. Because the fear in these places doesn't operate in a theatrical way. It creeps in from the feeling of deserted streets, thick shadows, heavy history, and local stories too specific to easily dismiss. From a road haunted by a predator to a town living in the shadow of a monster to places where the past never truly closes. This list will show you a very different kind of America. Quieter, darker, and far more inexplicable than it appears on the surface. Number 10. Port Gamble, Washington. In Port Gamble, the first thing that feels wrong is not the cemetery on the hill. It is the town beneath it. Everything here looks too intact. The houses are trimmed, the streets are neat, the silence feels organized. Port Gamble was founded in 1853 as a lumber company town, and it has survived in such complete form that the National Park Service called it the finest remaining example of a 19th century mill town on Puget Sound. That should make it charming. Instead, after dark, it makes the place feel suspended. Not ruined, not abandoned. Just held in place a little too carefully, like something preserved for reasons no one fully explains. Then your eyes drift uphill. Buena Vista Cemetery sits above the community, the millsite, and the bay, enclosed by a white picket fence that almost makes it seem peaceful. But the position of that cemetery matters. When it was first established, it stood outside the town. Over time, the town expanded around it. Life moved forward. The graves did not. They remained above the daily rhythms of Port Gamble, not far from memory, but fixed inside it. And what rests there gives the hill real weight. Among the known burials are roughly 20, perhaps 22 children under 12. A few women also appear to have died from childbirth complications. Those details are not scary in a theatrical way. They are worse than that. They are plain, historical, and painfully real. They remind you that this beautiful little town was also a hard 19th century mill town, shaped by labor, loss, and early death. Then comes the layer beneath even that. Long before Port Gamble became a company town, this was S'Klallam land, tribal history records that settlement moved in before lawful transfer of title. And elders remembered that S'Klallam people once lived where the general store and cemetery now stand before being pushed across the water. That is why Port Gamble lingers. Yes, the town sells ghost walks and paranormal events, but the deeper unease is not performance. It is the feeling that everything here has been kept too beautifully in place. After dark, Port Gamble does not feel empty. It feels occupied by another time. Number 9. Bishopville, South Carolina. In Bishopville, the story does not begin in a haunted house. It begins with a car that will not start. Late summer, humid air, a narrow road cutting along the edge of Scapore Swamp. You are driving home, nothing unusual until the engine cuts out and the headlights become the only thing holding back the dark. That is where it shifts. Because in Bishopville, the fear is not behind you. It is somewhere just outside the beam where the light stops and the swamp begins. And the light never reaches far enough. Scapore Swamp is part of a blackwater system tied to the Black River, and it does not behave like land most people trust. The ground is soft, the water is dark, the edges are unclear. Mud bleeds into reeds, reeds melt into shadows. Shadows sit just beyond what your eyes can confirm. Driving past it, you never feel like you are seeing the whole place. You feel like you are slicing through it, one narrow strip at a time, leaving everything else untouched. That feeling existed before the legend. Then 1988 gave it a name. The Lizard Man sightings began near this swamp, tied to reports of a young man stranded by the roadside after a late shift, describing something emerging from the darkness. Not a ghost, not a memory. Something physical, something that moved. That detail changed everything, because it meant the threat was not locked inside a building or buried in the past. It was out there, in the same space people were driving through every night. And it did not stay still. Reports spread along the roads skirting the swamp. Vehicles found damage, stories shifting from one stretch of asphalt to another. The fear in Bishopville does not belong to a single address. It travels. It follows the edges of water and roadie, appearing wherever visibility drops, and the world feels just slightly out of reach. For a time, it pulled the entire country in. Calls flooded the sheriff's office. Media crews arrived. Rewards were offered. Bishopville was no longer just a quiet agricultural town. It became the center of a modern monster panic, all focused on one question that never quite went away. If your car stopped out there, what would be standing just beyond your headlights? Number 8, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. In Point Pleasant, the creature is not hidden. It is standing in the middle of town. A polished metal statue of Mothman rises right on Main Street. Wings spread, red eyes glowing under the lights. Just steps away, the Mothman Museum draws visitors from all over. And every September, the town fills with crowds for a festival built around sightings that began in 1966. That is the first thing that feels unusual. Most places bury their darkest stories. Point Pleasant put theirs on display. It turned something people once whispered about into something everyone can walk up to, photograph, and celebrate. But that does not make it less unsettling. It makes it harder to ignore, because the story here was never just about a figure in the sky. The reports that followed those early sightings carried something stranger. Lights moving in ways people could not explain. Strange figures described as men who did not quite behave like men, radios cutting out, phones failing, cars stalling at the wrong moment. For a stretch of time, it felt less like a monster had appeared and more like reality itself had slipped out of alignment, just enough for people to notice. And most of it pointed to one place. The TNT area, a former World War II munition site just outside town where concrete bunkers still sit scattered across land that never fully returned to normal. After the war, the site was abandoned, leaving behind industrial remains, polluted ground, and low wetlands slowly reclaiming everything. It is not an empty field. It is a layered landscape of war, chemicals, and nature growing over what was left behind. That is where many sightings were centered. Not in some distant wilderness, but in a place shaped by human history and then quietly left to decay. Then came the moment that changed how the story would be remembered. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed, sending shock through the entire Ohio River region. The structure itself, an unusual I-bar suspension design dating back to 1928, failed suddenly, and the impact was immediate and devastating for the community. Over time, the memory of Mothman became tied to that night, not as proof, but as presence, as something that had been seen before everything went wrong. This is not just a town with a monster legend. It is a town where a creature was folded into public memory alongside a real tragedy. And once a story crosses that line, it stops being just a story. It becomes a warning people never fully stop hearing. Number 7, Cassadaga. Florida Cassadaga is not frightening because people believe in spirits. Cassadaga is frightening because the town was built to work with them. That is the difference. Most places earn their eerie reputation after something goes wrong. A tragedy, a rumor, a house. People stop entering after dark. Cassadaga began the other way around. Its origin story reaches back to a seance, to the account that George Colby was told he would help establish a spiritualist community in the South, then guided through the wilds of Central Florida by a spirit guide named Seneca to a place described as being surrounded by uncommon hills. So from the beginning, this town was not framed as normal ground, later disturbed by the unseen. It was framed as a place chosen for contact. And over time, that idea did not fade. It organized everything. Founded in 1894, Cassadaga is described by its own community as the oldest continuously active religious community of its kind in the Southeast, and its historic district has held national recognition since 1991. In the early 20th century, it grew into the second largest spiritualist center in the United States. That history matters because it means the supernatural here is not treated like gossip. It is structured, public, scheduled, church services, healing sessions, message services where certified mediums and student mediums stand before a crowd and deliver what they describe as spirit communication. Outside Call B Memorial Temple, even the healing gazebo formalizes the idea that unseen forces can be accessed, directed, and used. That is what makes Cassadaga unsettling. Not the claim itself, but how ordinary the claim becomes once you are inside town limits. Mediums and healers here are not presented as vague mystics drifting through candles and incense. They move through a system that includes years of certification, study in mediumship, healing, ethics, and decorum, then private appointments with their own posted fees. Even Hotel Cassadaga does not lean on history alone. It calls itself a spiritual sanctuary, offering readings, healing, tarot, astrology, dream interpretation, past life regression, and channeling as part of the experience. So in Cassadaga, you do not just visit a strange town, you enter a place built on the assumption that the boundary between worlds is real, reachable, and open for business. Number 6, Jerome, Arizona. Jerome does not feel like a town sitting on a hill. It feels like a town still trying not to slide off one. That is the first thing that makes it different. Plenty of old mining towns trade on ghosts, but Jerome gets under your skin before the ghost stories even begin. It clings to Cleopatra Hill at roughly 5,000 feet, stacked along steep grades and narrow streets, as if the whole place had to be pinned there by force. Once, more than 10,000 people lived here, drawn by some of the richest copper deposits in Arizona. Then the mines closed in 1953, the population collapsed to under 100, and Jerome nearly became what so many western boomtowns eventually become, a shell. It survived, came back through tourism, and was named a National Historic Landmark in 1967. But even now, it does not feel stable. It feels suspended. That feeling starts deep below the sidewalks. Jerome exists because of two massive ore bodies formed by ancient volcanic activity beneath a sea around 1.75 billion years ago, later pushed upward and worn down until they lay close enough to the surface to be mined. In other words, this town was born from pressure, rupture, heat, and exposure. Even its geology reads like something forced upward too violently to ever rest easy. Then there is the sliding jail, the town's most perfect symbol. Built in 1905, the concrete structure began shifting downslope in the 1930s, helped along by the unstable hillside and years of blasting from mining operations. It eventually moved more than 200 feet from where it started. At one point, locals had to reroute the road around it. That is not just quirky history. That is Jerome in one image. Even the jail could not stay put, and the hill itself was never solid to begin with. Jerome was not only built on a slope, it was hollowed from below. Underground mine workings spread beneath the town for decades, leaving modern Jerome perched above the carved-out remains of its own prosperity. Not because it feels abandoned, because it feels inhabited by imbalance. After dark, the streets do not seem haunted in the usual way. They feel like they are holding their breath above an emptiness that never completely closed. Number 5. St. Francisville, Louisiana. At Myrtle's plantation, the fear is not that something ugly survived. It is that something beautiful survived so perfectly it began to feel like camouflage. That is the first thing St. Francisville gets right. The white porches, the old oaks, the quiet cemeteries, the slow, polished elegance of a Louisiana town that still knows how to look composed. But the deeper you look, the less that beauty feels comforting. It starts to feel strategic, as if the grace of the place is not washing history away, only dressing it well enough to stay in view without ever being named too directly. No house carries that tension better than Myrtle's. The property began in the late 18th century as Laurel Grove, built by David Bradford, and later became the Myrtles under the Sterling family. Nothing about it fits the usual haunted house image. It is not broken down. It is not swallowed by weeds. It is too orderly for that. The long veranda, antique furnishings, stained glass, decorative ironwork, and filtered shade under the trees make it look less like a ruin and more like a southern postcard, still performing its own refinement. That is exactly why the darker parts strike harder, and then Chloe enters the story. She is remembered in local legend as a woman who worked in the house, forced to wear a turban to hide a mutilated ear, later accused of poisoning the owner's family and ultimately killed and thrown into the Mississippi.
Whatever parts belong to history and whatever parts belong to folklore, one detail keeps the story alive. Chloe is not described as a one-time shock. She returns as a repeated image, a woman in a long dress, a head wrap, a figure seen on the veranda near a window or noticed in a photograph only after the moment has passed.
And that is how Myrtles works, not through spectacle but through repetition. Doors opening and closing without explanation, footsteps crossing old wood floors when no one is there, objects subtly moved, mirrors reflecting something that feels just slightly off. None of it proves anything. That is what makes it effective. Because in St. Francisville, the past does not burst through the walls. It lingers in the manners of the house, in the evening tours, in the candlelit storytelling, in the way beauty itself seems to keep inviting old shadows back inside. Number 4, Villisca, Iowa. What makes Villisca unsettling is not just what happened there. It is the feeling that the story never properly ended. That is the part that lingers. Not the headlines, not the notoriety, the unfinishedness of it. On the night of June 9th into the early hours of June 10th, 1912, something happened inside a quiet house in Villisca that turned an ordinary Iowa town into one of the most enduring shadows in American true crime. There were investigations, suspects, arguments, even a trial, but no final answer ever settled cleanly over the case. And when a town never gets that answer, it does not move on the way it is supposed to. Morning arrives, life resumes. But some part of the place remains stuck, waiting for a conclusion that never comes. That is what gives Villisca its weight, because before that night, this did not look like a town destined for dark legend. It looked like a place built from routine, church schedules, neighborly familiarity, and the quiet confidence of people who expected tomorrow to arrive like any other. The family at the center of the story was well known in the community. The evening had the shape of normal life. And that is exactly why the rupture feels so deep. Nothing in the setting warns you. The horror is not that the town looked cursed. It is that it looked safe. Then the details begin to surface and the tone changes. Inside the house, the scene suggested not chaos, but an extended, almost deliberate presence. Mirrors were covered, windows and curtains were blocked. The lamp was adjusted to cast only a weak glow. Objects were left in ways that implied someone stayed in that space longer than anyone would want to imagine. That is what makes Villisca feel different from a simple crime story. The house does not carry the energy of panic. It carries the energy of a night that was stretched, arranged, and never fully released. Today, it operates as a living museum. And even the overnight experience is designed to keep the building close to its 1912 condition, without indoor plumbing, modern convenience, or the easy comfort of the present. That choice matters. In Villisca, the goal is not just to remember the past, it is to keep visitors uncomfortably close to the hour when it stopped feeling past at all. Number 3, Exeter, Rhode Island. In Exeter, the terrifying part was never the vampire. It was how reasonable the fear began to feel. That is what makes this town colder than most legends ever managed to be. Mercy Brown did not rise out of some isolated Gothic nightmare. Her story emerged from a much larger panic spread across New England, at a time when tuberculosis was tearing through families so relentlessly that people no longer experienced it as a medical problem. They experienced it as a presence, something invisible that kept returning to the same house, the same bloodline, the same exhausted family draining one person after another. And when science could not explain it clearly enough, folk logic stepped in. That matters. because many of the people involved probably would not have called what they were doing vampire hunting at all. That label came later, sharpened by outsiders and headlines. Inside communities like Exeter, this was closer to a desperate countermeasure, a belief that someone already gone might still be feeding on the living. Which makes the whole thing worse. No capes, no fangs, no theatrical evil. Just frightened people trying to interrupt whatever they believed was passing death from one body to the next. Then came the winter of 1892. Mercy Brown died in January when New England ground was frozen hard enough that burial conditions were complicated, and her body was reportedly kept for a time in a crypt. When she was examined in March, she appeared less decayed than other family members, and blood was still found in the heart. Today, that can be understood through cold temperatures and preservation. But in Exeter then, it looked like terrible proof. Not fantasy. Evidence. The kind that could turn grief into action. And even that did not end the story cleanly. Later records show the family's suffering did not simply stop there, which gives the whole episode an even darker weight. Mercy was never just one strange case. Exeter belonged to a wider New England world where isolation, winter, folk belief, and uneven religious life all overlapped long enough for the unexplainable to start feeling practical. That is why Exeter stays with you. Not because people believed in monsters, but because for one frozen stretch of American history, belief itself became a survival tool. Number 2, Adams, Tennessee. It did not start inside the house. It started out on the land, where John Bell was said to have seen something watching him that did not belong to any animal he could name. That detail matters because in Adams, the story never begins with creaking floors or shadowed hallways. It begins with the feeling that whatever came for that family did not rise from the house. It came in from outside, from the fields, from the quiet stretch of Tennessee land that should have been empty, and then it followed them in. At first it was small, knocks, scratches, sounds that stayed just ambiguous enough to ignore. But over time, the disturbances sharpened into something harder to dismiss. Bed covers pulled, hair tugged, objects moved, and then the shift that changed everything. It started speaking, not in whispers, not in fragments, in full responses. It answered questions, repeated prayers, sang, mocked, and carried on as if it were not just present but participating. That is what separates Adams from almost every other haunted town. This was never described as a force drifting through a space. It behaved like something with intention, something aware, something that wanted to be recognized. They called it Kate, and once it had a name, the story stopped feeling like a haunting and started feeling like a relationship. Because from that point on, the disturbances were no longer random. They were directed. From roughly 1817 to 1821, the activity was said to focus again and again on John Bell and his daughter Betsy, giving the entire account the shape of a prolonged siege rather than a series of isolated events. People came to see it for themselves. Visitors reported that the voice would respond to them, deliver information, even repeat sermons from miles away, as if it were demonstrating what it could do. Whether those claims hold up today is almost beside the point. What matters is how the story was remembered, not as a ghost, but as something that chose its targets, spoke its mind, and made sure Adams would never forget it had been there. Number 1, Elkhorn, Wisconsin. You are driving home too late, and the road has narrowed into that familiar kind of rural dark where your headlights feel less like vision and more like a temporary agreement with it. That is where Elkhorn gets under your skin. Not in a house, not in a cemetery, not behind some locked door at the edge of town. Here the fear lives on the road itself. In the moment your car becomes the only source of light and everything beyond it dissolves into tall grass, ditch water, and black Midwestern fields. Then something by the shoulder moves, and for 1 second you cannot tell whether it is feeding, watching, or waiting for you to slow down. That is the signature of Bray Road. What makes the Beast of Bray Road more effective than a standard werewolf legend is not just what it looks like, it is what it is said to be doing. Witness descriptions around Elkhorn kept circling the same details. A tall, fur-covered figure, somewhere around 5.5 to over 6 feet, gray-brown in color with claws, fangs, and the unnerving ability to rise onto 2 legs. But the detail that lingers is not the posture, it is the behavior. The creature is not remembered as appearing for a dramatic reveal. It is remembered crouched over roadkill, moving like a predator already engaged in something biological and immediate before anyone interrupted it. That is why the modern 1989 sighting hits so hard. Lori Andrizzi was not wandering through a Gothic ruin. She was just driving home after a late shift near Bray Road by Ori 43 when she noticed a shape at the roadside, slowed down and realized she was looking at a fur-covered thing eating an animal carcass. That setup is brutally ordinary. It taps into one of rural America's most basic fears. The empty road, the late drive, the thing that should not be standing there. And Elkhorn itself only sharpens the contrast. Publicly, it has long carried the image of a peaceful Midwest small town, even Christmas card town, wholesome, which makes the legend feel wrong in exactly the right way. It bends a polite American landscape out of shape. Add in older reports stretching back decades and a local reporter who gave the sightings a durable public form. And the result is not just a monster story. It is a stretch of road that never fully gave the dark back. Some of these towns look quiet. Some even look beautiful, but that's what makes them linger a little longer in your mind. Because the fear in these places doesn't always come from what you see. It comes from what feels just slightly off. The road that gets too dark too fast, the house that feels too still, the story that never quite ended. And once you notice it, you can't really unsee it. So the next time you're driving through a small town late at night, ask yourself one thing: would you keep going? Or would you slow down? And if you've ever passed through a place that felt like it was hiding something, drop it in the comments. Some of the most unsettling towns aren't the famous ones. They're the ones nobody talks about.